This lesson involves the section 79.21, sections A through D. So the next couple of lessons will actually be talking about how we check vehicles for New York State inspection. So this is more the nitty-gritty of the course. And we're going to do sections A through D now. So this section, section 79.21, applies to vehicles that are under 18,000 pounds. And that's as indicated on the registration. Remember, anything over 18,000 pounds receives a heavy-duty inspection, which is a Group 2 inspection. We are not preparing you for that type of a test. We're doing 18,000 pounds and less. This section does not apply to motorcycles. Again, that's a Group 3 inspection. Not preparing you for that type of inspection in this course. And there might be some owners out there that have vehicles over 10,000 pounds that may request a heavy inspection. But again, that's pretty rare. In fact, I don't think I've ever had that request. So we are able to inspect up to 18,000 pounds with our Group 1 inspections. This section talks about the safety portion of the inspection. There is an emission portion, which is found in 79.24. We'll get to that in a few weeks. And then lastly, the additional inspections that we have to do for trailers are found in 79.23. All right, brakes. Let's talk about how we inspect brakes. So we must perform a brake equalization test, which basically has us stepping on the brake pedal on a hard, level surface that's free from loose material. And we want to ensure that the vehicle stops in a straight line. If it pulls real hard, it fails due to that. And we have to figure out why it's pulling significantly when you do the brake equalization test. This test has to be performed after a complete inspection. The reason for that is during the inspection, we're required to remove wheels. On vehicles, we're required to remove at least one front wheel. And you're allowed to pull as many vehicles as you wish to. You're allowed to pull as many wheels as you wish to on a vehicle, but you are required to remove at least one front wheel. So this brake equalization test sometimes helps you to realize whether or not any issues were created when you pulled wheels. So make sure the brake equalization test is done after the complete inspection. But I want you to think about if you have a vehicle that has rear drum brakes, in order to do some of the rear drum brake inspection stuff, it's important that you pull rear wheels as well. So again, New York State requires you to pull one front wheel, but you can pull as many as you would like to do a thorough inspection. So again, the brake equalization test fails if the vehicle fails to make a straight stop without a significant wheel pull. Brakes also fail if when you are inspecting the wheel cylinders and calipers for leakage, if there is any leakage. I put a couple pictures here of some calipers and wheel cylinders to show you some possible spots where leaks can occur. Usually it's where the rubber seal meets the pistons, and so that's a place that we really need to look for leaks. We also need to inspect the lines and hoses for any leaks, cracks, any chafing, any flattened or restriction sections, or improper support. And we fail these lines and hoses if they're cracked, leaking, not secured, or if they're made of copper. Again, we want to make sure that we're using appropriate double-walled tubing when we do a repair on a brake line, because otherwise it fails. We're also looking to make sure that the lines don't contain compression fittings. So compression fittings are fittings that just squeeze two lines together, and they don't require the flaring that you would have in this type of a setup. This is an approved type of repair on a brake line where we flare the lines, and those flares are squeezed against the flange section of a union. Again, compression fittings are not designed to do that, and compression fittings do fail in New York State inspection. Hopefully you'll notice the difference between this picture and this picture. Notice where the threads are internally and externally, and you'll be able to find a compression fitting compared to a flare fitting. We also inspect the master cylinder for leakage and the reservoir fluid level. If the brake master cylinder is leaking, it fails. If the fluid level is not filled to its design level, it also fails. The next test we do is called the pedal reserve test. And basically, we step on the brake pedal with the engine running, because most of our cars, in fact all of them nowadays, have some sort of power brakes. With the vehicle stopped, we press the brake pedal with normal foot pressure, and we should have at least 1/3 of the brake travel remaining when the brake pedal stops moving down. So again, we want to look at the length of travel of the brake pedal, and as we press it, we want to make sure that we have at least 1/3 of the travel remaining when we're done. At the same time we're pushing on the pedal, we want to test for brake fade. So basically, again, we're having the engine running, we're using normal foot pressure, and we're testing to see that the brake pedal doesn't continually drop, doesn't slowly fade away from your foot. And again, we fail the New York State inspection if the pedal does not hold for at least 60 seconds. Typically, if it does fail, the reason for the fail is because of an external fluid leak, or possibly an internal fluid leak where fluid is bypassing the primary or secondary piston seals inside the master cylinder. So that's what this breakdown is. If you look at call-out section number 9 and number 3, those are your piston seals, as well as some of the call-out 6 and 20. So if those rubber seals fail, they bypass, the fluid bypasses the seal and your brake pedal will fade. The next test we have to do is to test the power brake function. So this test is done in kind of a unique way. The first thing we do is we shut the engine off and we pump the brake pedal until it gets hard. What we're doing is we're actually depleting the vacuum or pressure reserve. And once we do that, we step on the brake pedal and we start the engine. If the power brake unit is working, the brake pedal will fall slightly. It will just slowly drop from us, or slightly drop from our foot pressure. And what that does is it tells us that the power boost assist is helping us. If it does not fall slightly, that means that the brake booster is not working. Let's talk about drum brake linings. So we have to remove drums or remove the little plugs on the back of the backing plate to look at the sight through the sight window to see how thick the drum brake linings are. So when we check drum brake linings, if it's a bonded lining where the actual friction material is glued to the shoe table, the actual metal part of the shoe, the vehicle fails if the thinnest point of that brake shoe is less than 1/16 of an inch. Again, for bonded linings, it fails if it's less than 1/16 of an inch. If it has riveted linings, where the friction material is riveted, like the picture shown here, on where that shoe is sitting down flat, you measure the thickness of the shoe above the rivet head, and the vehicle fails if there's less than 1/32 of an inch over the rivet head. Typically, you're using like a tread depth gauge or a depth mic to measure these the shoe thickness. We also check to make sure that the friction material are not cracked, that part of the lining's not missing, that the lining's being held firmly against the shoe table. We're checking to make sure that the lining is not contaminated. And we're also checking to see that if it's a brake pad that we're talking about now, that the audible or visual sign, in other words, wear sensors, are touching the rotor. If they are, that fails New York State inspection. For front brake pads, or again, brake pads for on front or rear of any vehicle, if the brake pads are worn to the point where they're metal to metal, that would fail inspection. So again, when we go back to talk about drum brake linings, there's an actual thickness that we measure. For pads, there is no thickness that we measure. We're just making sure that the wear sensor or squealer is not touching the rotor and that the pads are not metal to metal. So again, if you're looking at this would fail New York State inspection. You can see the lining material has gone metal to metal. It's gone. And these brake pads would fail. Back to brake drums. We want to check the drums themselves. We want to look for cracks on the friction surface. So again, if I flip that drum that you're looking at over, and we're looking at where the shoe would actually touch the drum, if there's a crack extending to the open edge of the drum, that would fail. Your text does tell you that hairline heat cracks are okay, but again, we don't want cracks that extend to the open of the drum. We don't want any cracks on the outside of the drum. The vehicle fails if there's any mechanical damage other than wear. Okay, so if you look at that drum and there's some sort of mechanical damage other than just being worn, that would fail. And if the friction surface is contaminated, again, that can happen from brake fluid leaks. It can happen from axle lube getting past the axle seals and causing the brake to be contaminated. I can't stress enough that in order to check all of these things, you're going to want to make sure you're taking these drums off to check them. For brake rotors, again, we're checking for cracks that extend to the edge of the rotor. We're checking for mechanical damage other than wear. We're checking for, and I want to read this very carefully, for any distortion or scoring that would impair the braking system. It's kind of a generic, vague phrase, but you, the inspector, need to determine whether or not there's some sort of distortion or scoring that would impair the braking system. If you have any of these conditions, the vehicle fails New York State inspection. I have seen lots of rotors that look rusty, and you're like, wow, I wonder if that's a distortion or scoring that would impair the braking system. My recommendation is always take your New York State inspected vehicles for a test ride, and see, are the brakes distorted? Do the brakes pulsate heavily when you come to a stop? Do you hear grinding? A lot of this will give you an indication of whether or not there's a distortion or scoring that would impair the braking system. You basically want to know how the brakes feel. So again, this rotor right here looks pretty rusty, but again, the phrase that we want to really focus in on is there any distortion or scoring that this rotor has that would impair the braking system? Some inspectors would say yes, just by looking at it. Some inspectors would want to take it for a ride to verify. What about all of the other braking components that we haven't talked about? So you're required to do a visual check of the components of the braking system, and the brakes fail if there's any disconnected, improperly installed, broken, frozen, seized, bypassed, or missing components. So I'm going to scoot back to this picture of this master cylinder. I'm sorry, this caliper here on the left side of the screen. And those slider pins, if those slider pins are frozen, that would fail New York State inspection. And usually you have a good indication of this on the road test because the brakes won't feel like they're doing very well. So again, any component that's broken, missing, bypassed, frozen, seized, would fail New York State inspection. We also have to check the parking brake. So the way we check the parking brake is we set the parking brake firmly, and then we start the engine, place it in drive, and slightly touch the gas pedal, slightly. And it fails if the brake does not hold the vehicle. So obviously this car looks like it passes. He's applied the rear parking brake and is able to burn his front tires. Obviously we're not doing that in our test, but you get the point. You may run into a vehicle that has some form of electric parking brake that releases when the engine is running or driving. When the engine is running and it's placed into drive. There's no way to check that, and if that's the case, we don't have to worry about that function. Okay. Other parking brake checks is the vehicle fails if the parking brake cables are visibly frayed or frozen, if it's missing any kind of pins that or retractor springs, any rods or couplings that are worn, if the parking brake lever itself, whether it's a hand brake or a foot brake, if that will not release once you've applied it, that fails. If the little ratcheting mechanism will not hold the brake lever on when you release your foot or hand pressure, or if the parking brake and service brake are applied the same way. In other words, somebody's rigged up something where the parking brake is actually applied by the same service brake pedal, that would fail. All right, let's move on to tires. So we have to inspect all the mounted tires. We don't have to worry about the spare. And what we do is we check for the depth of the tread. So where we check it is to go to the major tread grooves, and we check the grooves that are showing the most wear. Okay, so vehicles that have some sort of parallel tread grooves, we want to check near the center of the tire, and I'll show a picture of this in just a second. So we fail a vehicle if the tires are worn to less than 2/30 seconds at two major adjacent tread grooves. Adjacent means next to each other. So we take two tread grooves, and if there's a spot where they are less than 2/30 seconds in two grooves next to each other, it fails. If you're working on a vehicle that's above 10,000 maximum gross weight, the front tires must be 4/30 seconds or more. So again, here's what we're looking at. So this tire has 4 major tread grooves. You can see that most tires have tread wear bars that tell you at 2/30 seconds whether the tire is worn to that point. So you need to have a spot on the tire where 2 major adjacent tread grooves are to 2/30 seconds or less. For other tire checks that we need to check, we need to make sure that the tires don't have any breaks or cuts in them, that there's no bumps, bulges, or knots, that there's no ply or cording structure that's exposed, and that the tire itself is not of restricted use. In other words, it's not temporary use, it's not for farm use, racing use, or labeled as not for highway use. You'll know if it's a temporary use vehicle, if it's like a temporary spare. Some people have full-size spares these days. So you want to check to make sure that you're not inspecting the spare tire. You'll know. Any of these conditions on this screen fail New York State inspection. So if we're looking at this tire real quick, would this tire pass or fail? And why would it pass or fail? Well, if you're looking at the tread depth, you can see the wear bars. It looks like it's above 2/30 seconds, so it would pass based upon tread depth. But if you look at the right-hand shoulder of that tire, there's some cording that's exposed. So that would fail New York State inspection. What about this one? Pass or fail? If you said this would fail because it has a bulge on the sidewall or a bump on the sidewall, you'd be correct. This does fail New York State inspection. We also want to check each vehicle for the proper number of wheel fasteners, and we fail the vehicle if it has any broken or missing wheel fasteners. So this example would fail because it's missing a lug nut. We have to check the tire pressures of all the vehicles, and we don't fail it if the tires are low, but when we're reporting into the CVIS machine, it will ask you if the tire pressures are all good. If they are not, it gives a little warning to the customer that they should fill up their tires. But, you know, as a technician that is trying to earn customers' respect and trust, I think it might just be best that we fill the customer's tires if they're a little low. All right, let's move on to Section D, which is your steering, suspension, front end, and chassis frame inspectable items. So the first thing we do is we do a steering wheel free play test. The way that we do this test is we start the engine. The engine must be running. We need to check to make sure that the power steering belt tension is good and that the power steering fluid level is good. With the wheels straight ahead, we move the steering wheel left and right until we see front wheel movement. And we should measure about how much free play we have in the steering wheel as we're moving the wheels left and right. So for a vehicle that has power steering, you're allowed 2 inches of free play. For manual steering vehicles, which I don't know too many of them around anymore, there will be 3 inches of free play that is allowed. We are also inspecting all of the steering linkage components. And we turn the wheel all the way to the left, all the way to the right, from stop to stop with the engine running, and we fail the vehicle if there's any tightness, binding, or interference in the steering travel, full left to full right. We then raise the vehicles off the ground, and we check the steering linkage and front end components for any wear or looseness. We fail if there's any wear or looseness found in the parts listed in section 79.21, section D, number 2. Now, I didn't list them, but it's found on page 41 of your textbook. I can read them very quick. So, excessive wear or looseness in wheel bearings, upper and lower cross shaft and bushings, upper and lower outer pins and bushings, idler arms, center control arms, tie rod ends, drag link ends, steering and pitman arms, the gearbox mounting, rack and pinion mounting, steering column mounting, steering wheel shaft movement, coupler or universal between the gearbox and steering column. We can't have any fraying or cracking in that coupler. We want to check the adjustable column lock or latch to make sure that the steering column is held securely. And we also want to check that the steering shock dampener to make sure it's not broken, missing, or leaking. So it's quite a list. If you're unsure of what any of those parts are, we need to go back to our steering suspension and steering textbook to determine what those parts are. We then look at springs. Okay, there's a number of different types of springs that we suspend vehicles with, but we fail the vehicle if there's any front or rear spring, and again we're talking about coil springs, leaf springs, air springs, torsion bars, shackles, that is sagging, broken, worn, or loose. So sometimes we want to actually notice the ride height of the vehicle. If one corner of the vehicle is hanging down, that helps us to know whether or not a spring is broken or worn. For any torsion bar or stabilizer bar and linkage that's broken, disconnected, missing, or bent, that would fail. So, most cars have stabilizer bars. We got to make sure that nothing's broken, missing, bent, or disconnected. Here's a picture of a coil spring. You see where the arrows are. You notice that the coil spring's broken. That would fail in New York State inspection. Here's a picture of a leaf spring, and if you follow the leaves, you'll see that the second leaf down is kind of on the left-hand side is like moving to the upward direction. That's because that leaf is broken. That would fail in New York State inspection. This is an example of a sway bar. The curved piece coming from the right upper corner of your screen should be connected by a stabilizer link pin, and that pin is broken. That would fail. This is also a fail. Not really related to New York State inspection, but kind of funny. That doesn't say Ford, that says fail, but if you see that on your car, that is also a fail. All right, let's talk about the chassis, frame, and primary unibody members. So we're looking the vehicle over for its frame, okay? And again, cars that have unitized bodies, we're looking for the primary unibody members, kind of like the boxy type of frame-looking parts. We fail the vehicle when we come upon any one of these things. If the front wheels are visually out of alignment, in other words, with your eyeballs you can tell wow, those front wheels are out of alignment, that would fail. If any axle or front end assembly is bent or twisted, that would fail. A chassis frame or primary unibody member is rusted at any suspension attachment point, would fail. Now, in Western New York, we have surface rust on things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about rusted to the point where that material is thin. So there's a little bit of wiggle room here for you to make a determination as an inspector on on what would fail and what would not. Any bolts, rivets that are loose, missing, or deteriorated due to rust would fail. And if there's any chassis or part of the frame or primary unibody member that's cracked or broken, would fail New York State inspection as well. We have to check the power steering. We check the power steering by obviously visually inspecting for any leaks. We want to start the car and see if the power steering feels like it's working. But we also have to check the power steering belt to ensure that it's not cracked or fraying. So on the right hand side, you're going to see something that we typically see. It's a serpentine belt that has these little micro V cracks, or little micro cracks in the V section of the belt. Those little micro cracks are okay. That would actually pass New York State inspection. I think although this belt, after a little bit while, it's going to start to look like the belt on the left, where sections of that belt are going to chunk out of it, and that would fail New York State inspection. You can read a little bit more about that on page 41 of your book. Shock absorbers. We have to check the shock absorbers of the vehicle and their mounting hardware. We have to fail vehicles that have shocks that are missing or broken, or that the mounting hardware, the mounting fasteners, the bolts are missing or broken. However, a leaking shock absorber does not fail. So again, these are your suspension shock absorbers. Those do not fail. If you go back to your steering dampener, the steering shock absorber, if you will, if that's leaking, that does fail. So again, difference between the steering shock damper, again, it looks like a shock absorber, versus the actual shock absorbers of the vehicle.